As the UN holds its 76th annual session of the General Assembly, world leaders pledged their renewed commitment to taking collective action to address the world's pressing challenges, facing a global pandemic, an ongoing refugee crisis, continuing conflict and growing mistrust. Can the UN still live up to its founding principles and deliver for people around the world? Hello and welcome to a special edition of Bigger Than Five from the United Nations headquarters in New York. I'm Vida Fakhri. The General Assembly convened its annual meeting of heads of state and government around the theme Building Resilience Through Hope to recover from COVID-19, rebuild sustainability, respond to the needs of the planet, respect the rights of people, and revitalize the United Nations. The Secretary General Antonio Guterres opened the Assembly's gathering by, as he put it, sounding the alarm, warning about the breakdown in trust in the United Nations system and the principles it stands for.
The people we serve and represent may lose faith not only in their governments and institutions, but in the values that have animated the work of the United Nations for over 75 years. We face a moment of truth. Now is the time to deliver. Now is the time to restore trust. And now is the time to inspire hope.
The Secretary General also called on member states to boost humanitarian assistance, increase their financial commitments to meet the challenges of climate change, and bridge the gap between rich and poor. But with major global challenges, a pandemic not yet under control, with only 32% of the world fully vaccinated, mainly in developed countries, and only 1 to 2% vaccinated in the majority of African countries, with climate change endangering humanity as we know it, with conflicts and tensions the UN is incapable of controlling, let alone preventing, an ongoing refugee crisis with more than 82 million people forcibly displaced at the end of last year. Is the UN system delivering for those who need it the most? To discuss these questions, I'm joined by Achim Steiner, Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP. Achim Steiner, the UN Secretary General sounded the alarm bell at the start of this General Assembly session. He spoke about the breakdown in trust, the loss of hope in the values of the United Nations, the climate crisis, the pandemic, the inequality gap. He also said the UN was facing, quote, a moment of truth. But haven't we heard all of this before?
Well, in some ways, yes, because none of these phenomena necessarily are unique or world premieres. But I think what the Secretary General tried to convey to the world at large, as leaders gathered here this week for this high-level segment of the UN General Assembly, is that there comes a point at which multiple crises can first of all lead to paralysis. Paralysis can create problems in its own right. The world is confronted at the moment with a series of choices that it has to make, first of all in managing the crisis of the pandemic, but also the challenge of climate change and how a world can respond collectively to that. And it is the coming together of all of these crises that really puts the world under great stress. And I think that was his key message.
But the Secretary General is right, isn't he? There is a global lack of confidence, of trust in the United Nations. We hear all of these wonderful, lofty speeches being made, but there's very little concrete, substantive results at the end of the day, isn't there?
I don't think the Secretary General necessarily implied that. I would argue that the United Nations is a reflection of the world. At the end of the day, what is the United Nations? It is the member states who come together in an institution. Now, in part, they empower that institution to act on their behalf. In part, they use this institution to arrive at a consensus to act together as nations.
But we always hear this word, consensus, at the United Nations. It's almost a word that a lot of times people hide behind. It minimizes the pressure that should be applied on some, let's face it. Shouldn't some of the world's wealthiest, most powerful countries be taken to task to make sure that they are implementing some of their promises?
You know, the direct mandate is not one of a world government. So the United Nations cannot take one country and take it to task. It has a Security Council, for instance, that on issues of international peace and security can indeed take decisions. But, you know, at the end of the day, our ability to act on a challenge such as climate change is premised upon sovereign nations being willing to cooperate with one another. And in that sense, I think the world community can take individual nations to task, it can hold its other to account. But I think in a context like climate change, the Framework Convention on Climate Change is precisely what you just alluded to. Every year, the United Nations brings all nations together in the spotlight of public attention, and countries who are not willing to act are feeling the pressure. That's why we are now at a point where we are truly working with the Paris Agreement.
But all countries aren't equal when it comes to how much they pollute. I know UNDP says that all countries must do their bit. The Secretary General, it's all very well and good. He sounds the alarm bell and talks about the need for collective action on climate change, but he isn't pointing fingers at the main culprits, again, because they are powerful countries. Is this the kind of bold leadership that is required at a time like this?
You know, let me say, I think this Secretary General on the issue of climate change has spoken more clearly to individual countries, to the issue of phasing out coal, to the imperative of acting, to the G20 taking responsibility, to nations not honoring their pledge on the $100 billion of climate finance that were there. I think this Secretary General has stepped well out of the comfort zone in actually making nations understand that their promises are not being kept. So beyond that, however, the ability to act lies within those countries.
But we never hear him taking on the big major economies, China, the US, and others. I mean, he himself has said that 80% of the pollution in the world is done by major countries, the G20 countries, in fact. Shouldn't we hear more said about the countries that are polluting the most?
Well, I think if you look at the speeches of the Secretary General, if you look at his engagement with the G20 leaders, if you also, I represent the United Nations in the G20 track, for example, with finance ministers, central bank governors. Climate change is a message that we are constantly bringing to the G20, and the Secretary General attends the G20 summits. And if you look at his letters that he has brought to each of those summits, the issue is very much being articulated there. But you also have to, in a sense, acknowledge that a Secretary General sometimes has to work behind the stage, because that is where you can sometimes achieve the greatest progress. So you can point the finger, you can also call out, but you must also engage. And I think that simply has to be recognized, that that is not always happening on the front part of the stage where the cameras and the limelight are.
I mean, of course, there are political realities. We all know that you cannot change the 5 permanent members of the Security Council who essentially call the shots. But how important is it for the UN to show that kind of bold, courageous leadership, for the UN Secretary General to be more than a chief executive officer of the Secretariat, to be an arbiter, a compass to guide countries to the finish line and to really urge them to do their bit?
I think each Secretary General brings their own expertise, their own style, and also the moment in time in which they lead the United Nations. And I think what we have seen just in the last few years is a moment in time when the Secretary General was being stopped from articulating some of those issues. Then a moment in time where the world turns to the Secretary General to actually speak to the world at large. And I would say, if you look at where we are right now, whether it is on the pandemic, whether it is on climate change, whether it is on inequality, whether it is on digitalization and cybercrime, the Secretary General is giving the world an agenda on which to, first of all, agree that these are the priorities, and secondly, that we must work together.
But he's completing his 5th year in office. Many would argue that he largely is nowhere to be seen or heard on all the important issues. Do you think that the start of his 2nd term might see a change, that we might see a different type of leadership?
Well, let those who make that claim argue it for themselves. As somebody who works every day within the United Nations system with the Secretary General, I can assure you that this is an organization led by a Secretary General that essentially knows no working hours. But it is also a fact that the last few years have been extremely challenging. Multilateralism, the United Nations, its authority, its credibility have been put into question, sometimes for very parochial reasons, for tactical reasons. And let's also be clear, we are entering a phase in which geopolitical tensions are once again making the spirit and the idea of the United Nations something that has to be fought for every day on every issue.
But there are lots of conferences and events, and there's another COP around the corner, COP26 in Scotland at the beginning of November. But here we are, many countries and member states of the United Nations still haven't implemented the commitments they made at COP21 in Paris in 2015. Is there any point in adding new ambitious plans when, let's face it, the ones that are there on the table haven't been met and aren't likely to be met anytime soon?
Well, let me answer your point in two ways. First of all, I'm the first one to not want to make the world look rosier than it is. I mean, in terms of where the science tells us we need to be and where the world is right now, the gap is of extreme concern. Where I don't agree with your characterization is that it looks at a glass and only describes the fact that it's half empty. What we have seen just in the last few years is a remarkable increase in investments in clean energy, in energy transitions, the advent of new technologies for mobility. We now live in a world where every year the world invests more in clean energy technology than in oil, gas, coal and nuclear combined when it builds electricity. Just give me an opportunity, because it's important for people to also sense that we are making progress. We have just seen announcements this week here that if they had been made 10 years ago, would have been revolutionary. China committing to no longer finance coal-fired power stations in the developing world or anywhere in the world at all. The United States doubling its finance commitment precisely to this international co-investment commitment. These are developments that are very significant. The problem is...
But you still find subsidies for fossil fuels and so on.
Indeed.
So on the other hand, there's a lot still that needs to be done.
There is a lot wrong. And frankly speaking, I think the world will one day, when it writes its history books about the beginning of the 21st century, be extremely critical about the inertia, the complacency, and the self-serving arguments that have been deployed in order to not accelerate action. But the good thing is, people all over the world can see that those who argue we cannot do this energy transition have run out of excuses. And that is why we are seeing the kinds of changes that are now happening in the world.
And part of the changes and the deeper inequalities that we're seeing in the world, not just between nations, but among nations themselves, have to do with the pandemic. Today, more than 760 million people, that's 10% of the world's population, live in extreme poverty. The Secretary General said this week that bridging the gap between rich and poor will require, in fact, ending the pandemic for everyone, everywhere. He said we must ensure that 70% of the world is vaccinated by mid-2022. How realistic is that, though, when today poor countries in the South, in Africa, have only vaccinated 1 to 2% of their population? Again, lofty speeches.
Look, this pandemic has given us extraordinary moments of breakthrough human ingenuity, extraordinary moments of tragedy and failure. Now, the simple fact is that here we are in September 2021. There are parts of the world that have access to, have the money and have the production, and yes, have obtained the vaccines for their people. And then we have a continent like Africa where barely 3 to 5% of the population have been vaccinated. But we have just had a vaccine summit. President Biden, the G20, I think it has taken too long for them all to come to the point of realization that there is no end to this pandemic unless it ends everywhere. Now,
so how do you make sure that wealthy countries in the north who are hoarding a lot of these vaccine reserves actually share them with low-income countries that need them?
Starting with the Secretary General for the last 12 months, appealing to the world, then together with the WHO establishing the COVAX facility, then going to every G20 summit and reminding world leaders how great a risk they were taking by not addressing vaccine inequity, by continuing to speak to the public and to the world, by meeting with the pharmaceutical companies, by mobilizing citizens. That is the work of the United Nations every day, and that is why we are sitting here in September now, and actually we can begin to believe that maybe by the end of this year, the idea of 40% of the world's population being vaccinated is not yet reachable, but perhaps by 2022, 70% is moving within the realm of the feasible. And to those who say it's impossible to achieve, I would say to them, look, the first problem is we didn't have a vaccine until the beginning of this year. Secondly, then we had a production problem. Then we had a distribution and access problem. Now, by the end of 2021, some of these issues are being resolved, and I think we will be at a point in time where there is no excuse left for the world to have that kind of brutal vaccine inequity continue into next year that we have seen this year.
But I just wonder on a concrete level, because yes, you can go around and talk to people and urge them, but we do know that some of the wealthy countries have vaccine doses in reserve. They haven't been sharing them. In fact, the COVAX facility, which was established to fight vaccine hoarding and nationalism, is not producing very good results. It's producing meager results.
Let us first recognize two factors. The United Nations appealed to the world community a year ago when COVAX was established to provide it with the financial means in order to obtain the vaccines and avoid precisely the kind of situation we found ourselves in now, where essentially those who have the funding or who have the production facilities will control the vaccines and therefore acquire them for themselves. The world did not step up to the plate. It yet again ignored the United Nations at precisely the moment that we created it for, which is to anticipate a crisis.
Let me ask you about one of the major critical issues in the world today, Afghanistan. In its latest report published this month, UNDP warned that, quote, Afghanistan teeters on the brink of universal poverty, that as much as 97% of the population could sink below the poverty line unless a response to the country's political and economic crisis or crises is urgently launched. UNDP study also shows there could be a 25% increase in the poverty rate. How does Afghanistan get out of this predicament if the new government in Kabul is isolated diplomatically? What needs to happen?
Well, the simple if complicated answer is not on its own. I think this is part of the reason why UNDP, why the Secretary General, some of our humanitarian sister agencies are speaking to the world right now and saying, look, this is a moment on which the political engagement with Afghanistan came to an end. But at the same time, we have to realize there are development gains over the last 20 years that are not an illusion. The GDP doubled, girls in their millions went to school, the parliament had 1/4 of women representatives, and I could go on. Micro enterprises in Afghanistan are 80% women run.
But that all disappeared overnight.
Well,
and the humanitarian situation is such that the country could run out of food, according to the Secretary General, by the end of this month. That didn't happen overnight.
Well, food can very quickly become a crisis point. I think what is of particular concern is that there is an economic implosion. No salaries are being paid, no seeds are available to plant for the winter, and you could go on, salaries are not being paid in the health centers. What we need right now is a very pragmatic view that is, in a sense, parallel to the, let's say, geopolitical dynamic that will play out with Afghanistan and the international community. The people of Afghanistan are facing an economic implosion, and with it will come precisely the loss of everything that has been built up by the country with international partnerships, and I think it will also create the conditions under which a self-fulfilling prophecy will basically happen, which is all the political disruption and, in a sense, people giving up and not staying on their land, in their villages, in their homes, but literally having to become internally displaced people, refugees. That is the moment in which the international community has to make a hard decision now. Do we turn our backs on the people of Afghanistan, or do we find a way of remaining engaged, even if the political context is a very complicated one?
Do you believe the US and the World Bank should unfreeze funds, unfreeze projects, because it is being reported that without World Bank budgetary support, the health system, which is already not great, could completely collapse?
Look, the simple fact is that in order to maintain a health system, 2,100 health clinics, including mobile clinics in the midst of a pandemic right now, requires funding. I think for those who argue it's simply a matter of unfreezing funds, they underestimate the complexity in both political and operational terms. I think what we have to do is look at the funds that are available in the international community. Some of them are with the World Bank, some of them are in the capitals of the world. And frankly speaking, a lot of funding would have traditionally gone into the military security operation, could now be available to actually support people in Afghanistan directly. In one way or another, there has to be a way in which the United Nations family in particular, which has still its operational capacity in Afghanistan, must be enabled and empowered to reach the people of the country right now.
But the World Bank can make a quick decision, because the situation in Afghanistan, I don't think, can afford to wait too long. You have millions of people whose lives is on the line. The World Bank could change policy on Afghanistan. The US Treasury could release $9.5 billion belonging to the Central Bank of Afghanistan. There is a certain urgency. Would you call on them to do that?
This is a moment of opportunity to act or losing an opportunity to act. It is a window of time. And in that sense, yes, we are advocating very much for the international community to look at how it can mobilize financing. I think what we should not underestimate is that we have had a major political rupture within Afghanistan and between Afghanistan and the international community. I think it requires careful diplomacy, discussions, and as you have also seen, there is currently a degree of dialogue that is happening with the leadership in Afghanistan. I think where the world has to be pragmatic right now is to use the humanitarian corridor, first of all. Humanitarian support to Afghanistan is about saving lives. At the same time, we have a development emergency that is occurring. We also have to save livelihoods. This can happen even if some of the, let's say, more formal and political aspects of how the world will engage with Afghanistan are yet to be resolved. In that sense, the World Bank, but any capital, be it Washington, London, Berlin, Brussels, Tokyo for that matter, I think have a key role to play. And again, there is also a group of countries, including Qatar and others, who are, I think, forming a group of nations that can hopefully broker a way forward here, because otherwise we will have a country that is 97% below the poverty line, possibly by middle of next year.
Is there a plan, though? Is there a strategic plan? Because there was a pledging conference in Geneva just recently, which surpassed targets, that's true, but just $1 billion were pledged. What is the long-term strategy beyond pledging money every few months? And let's face it, there isn't going to be a $1 billion pledged each time either. Is there a plan in place? Should there be one?
$1 billion can save a lot of lives. I would not play that sum down, especially in the current circumstances, in just a few weeks after a dramatic turn of events that, you know, in a sense have reset the entire table around which working with Afghanistan will have to emerge again. So let us recognize that flash appeal and the ability for the United Nations to engender the confidence in the international community to make that commitment to the people of Afghanistan. But I think, as you rightly point out, there is a macroeconomic dimension to Afghanistan that will not be solved by $1 billion. And then there is
or
the people's
by
economy.
a band-aid approach. Should there be something more fundamental?
Absolutely.
that
And I
changes?
think we always need to recognize that we are just a few weeks since one government was overthrown and a whole new political reality has emerged. There is a great deal of discussion. Yesterday we had the G20 foreign ministers meeting convened by Italy, meeting here and virtually in New York, in order to try and bring alignment amongst the G20 countries on how to respond to Afghanistan. The United Nations Development Programme, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, the World Food Programme. We are actually working day and night at the moment in order to not let the worst case scenario become reality. But for that we need support, we need the political space, and we need the ability to actually work with the people of Afghanistan on the ground. Otherwise, there is no way we can deliver the kind of support that will save lives and livelihoods.
Will you be visiting, should the SG as well visit, and engage directly with the Taliban government?
Look, I think at the moment we have had four UN senior officials visit Kabul. There are daily contacts that are happening through our special representative. I think the re-engagement of the United Nations with Afghanistan has begun. WFP's United Nations Humanitarian Air Service is now operating. Our staff are able to move in and out. Emergency goods are coming in and out. And it is certainly not for me to determine when the Secretary General's travel may be on the agenda or not. As far as I'm concerned, my team, my infrastructure that UNDP can bring to what Afghanistan needs right now is essentially fully operational. It just needs to be given the space and the means to actually roll out.
Okay. Achim Steiner, UNDP Administrator, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Another General Assembly, another opportunity for the world's political leaders to gather in the building behind me, to make big, sweeping promises about the need to work together to tackle some of the threats that the United Nations founders and the drafters of the UN Charter had not envisaged and could not have foreseen 76 years ago: climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic. At the time of the founding of the UN in 1945, 51 countries committed to a charter that emphasized international peace and security and friendly relations among nations. Today, the UN has 193 member states, but for most of the world, the UN is looked at through the prism of the Security Council. In fact, through the prism of its 5 permanent members. Is the power, the centrality of the P5s what is making the United Nations dysfunctional, anachronistic, an institution perpetuating an unfair world order? The Secretary General says the UN is, quote, facing a moment of truth. Now is the time to deliver. But deliver what? And shouldn't he lead the way? Perhaps the work needs to begin by ensuring that the Charter is being implemented fully, adhered to, respected by all member states, large and small, first and foremost, the big powers and the Secretaries General and other leaders within the UN who have the potential to be important players whenever they are truthful to the Charter. Short of that, the UN will be a sideshow and occasionally a fig leaf, but ultimately obsolete. That's all from me, Rida Fakhri from the UN in New York. Thanks for watching. See you next time.